Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. With his second term now secure, is President Obama's signature health care law a sure thing? From health insurance exchanges to a vast expansion of Medicaid, ObamaCare is heavily dependent on state implementation, and a growing number of the nation's 30 Republican governors are saying they won't do the federal government's bidding. Wisconsin's Scott Walker is one of them, and he joins me now. Governor, great to have you with us.
Paul, good to be with you.
So when you wrote to HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, you said you weren't going to set up a state exchange because you wouldn't have the flexibility to make it work. Why don't you elaborate on what you mean by lack of flexibility?
Well, for all the talk, each of us as governors can comply with the law one of three ways: a state-run exchange, a partnership, or deferring to the federal government. And for any of the folks who are lobbying me to have a state-run exchange, they really need to realize in the end there is no real flexibility. And in terms of final outcome, there is no substantive difference between each of the three options. All of them lead to a federally run exchange in one way or the other. A great example of that is talking over the last few weeks to my friend Gary Herbert, the governor of Utah.
Right.
Utah, Paul, as you know, and probably most of your viewers know, years ago, 5-6 years ago, set up their own exchange. They did it in a free market way. They did it working with small businesses in their state. They have one of the lowest costs of any state in the country when it comes to health care. They still have quality health care, but they did it through a market-driven exchange. According to my friend Gary Herbert, that doesn't qualify under the new Affordable Care Act, and so they're going to have to come back and put in place something that more aligns them with what the federal government wants. To me, I said you get all the exposure without any of the flexibility. That's not a good deal. And on behalf of the taxpayers in my state, I said, no, thank you. We'd rather have the federal government take on not only responsibility, but the responsibility for paying for it and not defer that to our taxpayers.
Isn't there a risk, though, that if the federal government runs the entire show, that you guys will be cut out totally, and that basically you'll have even less room for maneuver? Your companies in the state, your providers in the state will really have to march entirely to Washington's dictates.
Well, there's that risk, but the reality is we looked at this. In fact, we started looking at it literally 2 years ago in December of 2010, right after the election. I and a bunch of the other new governors in both parties went to the White House, went and met in the old executive office building with Secretary Sebelius and others, and they talked about flexibility then. The reality, though, is the flexibility was really limited mainly to things like how many staff from the state do you have? Do you have a handful like Utah, or do you have hundreds like Massachusetts? In terms of regulation of what has to be included, how it's governed in your state, those things are all essentially dictated through the federal government. And for all the talk about flexibility, right, it really doesn't happen. I got to tell you, though, as a governor who believes in federalism, who believes in the 10th Amendment, instinctively, my gut, when given the chance on anything, is to have the state run it over the federal government. But you look at things like the food stamp program, food
right,
share. You look at things like special education. That's a mandate that for years has been mandated by the federal government and the states and the school districts in our country, and never comes close to covering the cost of that. I think most of us who said no and deferred to the federal government did so because we didn't want the cost incurred upon our taxpayers.
Well, as the law is drafted, I gather that the subsidies can only flow through state exchanges. That is, the subsidies for individuals to have health care. Now, so if the federal government delivers the exchange in your state, runs it, then at least as drafted, the subsidies will not be able to flow. Was that part of your calculation as well in this decision?
No, I think in the end there's a series of things, that being one of them, some other things in terms of insurance regulation within a state beyond just an exchange itself. Those are things that I think all of us as governors, including some Democrats who did the same thing we did and deferred to the federal government, we're going to come back to the Congress, work with members of both political parties. I think those are reasonable adjustments, technical type adjustments that the Congress should be able to make going forward. Because as you know, and again, your viewers know, most of these decisions were made just a few years ago about this time of year,
right,
late in the game without any real input from governors or, for that matter, just about anybody else. And these are the technical things that if you're going to have it, at least make it work. I objected to it. I fought it in court. I fought it politically. I lost those battles. I've conceded that. I've conceded that, at least for the time being, there'll be exchanges in my state that just won't be run by the state. But right, I think if you're going to make it work, most people realize there has to be some technical adjustments.
But one of the things you did win on in the court case was Medicaid. So now states have the option of opting out of the Medicaid expansion. That is a big part of this bill. Have you made a decision on Medicaid yet? Are you going to opt in or out?
I have not, but I got to tell you, much as I did about the original question, I have, and as do governors in both parties, some real hesitations about the expansion. In our state, for example, Wisconsin already has over 90% of our people covered. We have one of the most extensive coverage systems in the country. So that's part of the reason why we fought the bill in the first place. And we already do it pretty well. There's a small number of people. Why blow up the whole system for that? But having said that, our real concern is it's 100% reimbursement for this expansion for the first 3 years under the actual terms of the law itself. If you just read it, 3 years from now, it drops down to 90%. Any of us who've dealt with the federal government before and anything else, and special ed was a good example I gave before, know that they come nowhere near those sorts of goals several years after the legislation. And so I think many of us are concerned looking ahead to the future saying, are you going to add massive numbers of people on Medicaid? Some in more states more than others. In ours, it would be a relatively minimal number compared to other states, but still, would we be adding people and not have the funding? And that's assuming they comply with the law. In light of the fiscal cliff and everything else out there, there's a very real possibility, even within the next year or two, that Medicaid funds to states might be reduced. And without true flexibility through a block grant, we have a real tough time dealing with what we have today, let alone adding more.
Now, what's your estimate of the number of people on Medicaid that you would have to add under the expansion? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Well, it varies. That's part of one of the challenges with this whole law, not just on the Medicaid expansion, but even in the terms of the law itself. And when we looked at the exchange, we thought the cost of just the exchange could go up to as much as $60 million. For us, the number that would be eligible fluctuates depending on what we can do with the rest of our population. And I think for a lot of governors, that's also part of the concern. If we had a concrete answer to this, it might be easier to make those decisions. But we keep sending questions to the administration, not just from the Republican governors, but from the National Governors Association. And repeatedly, we get letters back that really don't answer those questions, and that's part of the problem.